On a freezing October night in 1907, Pierpont Morgan locked the country's most powerful financiers inside his private library at Madison Avenue and 36th Street. Outside, depositors were queued around city blocks. Inside, Morgan reportedly told them, "This is where the trouble stops." He was not a regulator. He was not a government official. He was one man, a private banker, who had just been handed effective control over the entire American financial system by a desperate president. Morgan spent that night extracting commitments from the men in that room, forcing them to pledge millions of their own capital to save banks that were their competitors. By dawn, he had assembled a $25 million rescue fund, enough to keep the New York Stock Exchange from closing for good. The Panic of 1907 was solved not by the United States Treasury, not by Congress, not by law, but by one man's personal authority and a library full of terrified rich people. That fact tells you almost everything you need to know about how financial power actually worked in the Gilded Age, and it tells you more than you might expect about how it works now. The Gilded Age, the period Mark Twain satirized as a thin gold veneer over base metal, produced 3 devastating nationwide panics in a single generation. The panics of 1873, 1893, and 1907 each followed the same basic architecture. A speculative boom fueled by cheap credit, a sudden loss of confidence, a cascade of bank failures, and a depression that followed. Each panic destroyed fortunes, remade industries, and exposed the fatal fragility of an unregulated financial system. And each panic, in its own way, reveals the mechanics of how wealth is really built, controlled and preserved, not through brilliant investing, but through leverage, connections, and the ruthless exploitation of other people's money. Consider the Panic of 1873. Its trigger was a single failure. J. Cook and Company, America's premier banking house, closed its doors on September 18. Cook was the financier of the Union Army during the Civil War, having raised what amounted to $1 billion in today's money for the war effort by selling government bonds to a public that had never before invested in securities. He was the most trusted name in American finance. When his firm failed, the shock was immediate and absolute. Cook's downfall was railroad bonds, specifically the Northern Pacific Railway. Cook had agreed to finance the railroad's project to connect the Oregon coast with the existing Northeastern network, selling $100 million in bonds to fund construction through largely unsettled territory. The problem was that the first transcontinental line had already been completed in 1869. Cook was financing overcapacity, a second route through land that had few settlers and even fewer customers. He had invested so heavily in Northern Pacific bonds that when European investors, spooked by a stock market crash in Vienna, began selling their American railroad securities, Cook had no buyers and no liquidity. By September 1873, his firm had accumulated $5 million in debt it could not repay. The House of Cook, the man who had once asked why this grand and glorious country should be stunted and dwarfed by miserable hard coin theories, was bankrupt. The panic that followed was devastating. The New York Stock Exchange closed for the first time in its history, remaining shut for 10 days. More than 100 banks failed nationwide. Over 25% of American railroads went bankrupt. The resulting depression lasted until 1879 and was so severe that it was known simply as the Great Depression until the 1930s claimed the title. What the Panic of 1873 reveals about wealth is uncomfortable. Cook was not a bad financier. He was a brilliant one. He had built the most successful banking house in America by mastering the art of selling government debt. But he made the classic mistake of the leveraged speculator. He borrowed short to lend long, using depositors' money to fund illiquid railroad bonds that could not be sold when markets turned. His fortune was built on other people's trust. When that trust evaporated, so did he. 20 years later, the Panic of 1893 proved that nothing had been learned. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad went bankrupt on February 20, 1893, having vastly overextended itself. Within the next year, more than 150 railroads followed, including the Northern Pacific, again, the Union Pacific and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. Over 15,000 companies failed. More than 600 banks suspended operations or closed entirely. Unemployment reached 20% nationally, and in some cities it was even higher. The Panic of 1893 was triggered by the same mechanism as 1873, overbuilt railroads, excessive leverage, and a sudden withdrawal of European capital, but it was compounded by a monetary crisis. The United States Treasury's gold reserves had fallen perilously close to the statutory minimum, making it impossible to redeem paper currency for gold. The government was effectively broke at the worst possible moment. What the Panic of 1893 reveals is the relationship between wealth and the state. The railroads that collapsed had been built with massive federal subsidies, land grants, bond guarantees, and direct cash payments. The Northern Pacific alone had received 47 million acres of public land from the federal government. These were not private enterprises in any meaningful sense. They were public-private partnerships in which the government bore the risk and private speculators took the profits. When the bubble burst, the railroads declared bankruptcy, their bondholders took massive losses, and the government was left holding worthless paper. The wealthy men who had built these empires, men like Cook and the railroad barons, did not lose everything. Many of them, Cook included, eventually rebuilt their fortunes. The workers who lost their jobs and the farmers who lost their land did not. The Panic of 1907 was different. It was not triggered by railroads but by copper. Specifically, by a failed attempt by speculators F. Augustus Hines and Charles Morse to corner the market on the stock of the United Copper Company. When their scheme collapsed, depositors began running on the banks associated with the copper speculators. The panic spread quickly to the trust companies, lightly regulated institutions that had grown almost as large as the national banks, but faced lower reserve requirements and lacked access to the clearinghouse system that could provide emergency liquidity. The third largest trust company in New York City, the Knickerbocker Trust, was forced to close on October 22 when depositors withdrew $8 million in a single day. What made 1907 different was the response. With no central bank and no lender of last resort, the system had no mechanism to stop a panic except private action. Morgan, then 70 years old, took charge. He assembled a consortium of bankers, extracted pledges of capital, directed the Treasury to deposit $35 million into national banks, and then instructed those banks to lend the money to the trust companies. He personally pledged his own money to stabilize the situation. He even bought New York City bonds to prevent the city from becoming insolvent. By the time the panic subsided, the New York Stock Exchange had fallen almost 50% from its peak the previous year, but the financial system had survived. The Panic of 1907 reveals the most important lesson of all about how fortunes are really built and preserved. When the system breaks, the system's insiders save themselves. Morgan did not rescue the Knickerbocker Trust. He let it fail. He rescued the institutions that mattered to him and his peers, the banks and brokerages that were too interconnected to fail. He did not act out of altruism. He acted because a collapse of the entire financial system would have destroyed his own fortune, along with everyone else's. The rescue of 1907 was not a bailout of the public. It was a rescue of the wealthy by the wealthy, using other people's money, the Treasury's deposits, the commitments of other bankers, and the gold that Morgan coordinated to import from London. The parallels to 2008 are so close they are almost uncomfortable. In both crises, a lightly regulated shadow banking system, trust companies in 1907, investment banks and mortgage lenders in 2008, had grown to rival the regulated banking system. In both crises, a speculative bubble in a single asset class, railroads in 1873 and 1893, housing in 2008, burst and triggered a cascade of failures. In both crises, the government had no clear authority to intervene and had to improvise a response through a combination of Treasury action and private coordination. And in both crises, the ultimate resolution was the same. The insiders saved themselves, using public money when necessary, and the public bore the cost of the cleanup while the wealthy preserved their fortunes. The difference, of course, is that 2008 had the Federal Reserve. The Panic of 1907 was the direct catalyst for the Fed's creation in 1913. The bankers who had been rescued by Morgan's private intervention realized that they could not count on another Morgan appearing in every crisis. They needed a permanent lender of last resort, a federal governmental Santa Claus, as one critic put it, who would always stand ready to bail out banks in trouble. The Federal Reserve was not created to protect depositors or stabilize the economy. It was created to protect the banking system from itself, to ensure that when the next panic came, the wealthy would not have to lock themselves in a library and beg each other for money. They could simply call the Fed. What the Gilded Age panics teach us about modern market crashes is that the mechanics of financial crisis have not changed in 150 years. The names change, J. Cook becomes Lehman Brothers, Northern Pacific bonds become collateralized debt obligations, copper speculation becomes mortgage-backed securities, but the underlying structure is identical. Wealth is built on leverage. Leverage is built on debt. Debt is built on confidence. And confidence is built on nothing more than the belief that other people will keep believing. When that belief fails, the entire edifice collapses. The people who survive these collapses are not the ones who saw them coming. They are the ones who control the mechanisms of rescue, the ones who can call the Treasury, convene the consortium, pledge the capital, and direct the flow of emergency liquidity. In 1873, that was J. Cook until he was not. In 1907, it was J.P. Morgan. In 2008, it was the Treasury Secretary and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve. The names change, the titles change, but the function is the same. Fortunes are not built by superior insight or harder work. They are built by access to leverage and control over the system that allocates leverage. They are preserved by the ability to call in favors when the system breaks. The Gilded Age panics also reveal a deeper truth about how wealth is controlled. The wealthy are never as wealthy as they appear. Cook's empire was built on bonds he had not yet sold, railroads he had not yet built, and land that had not yet been settled. Morgan's empire was built on relationships and trust, not on liquid assets. The modern equivalent is the tech founder whose net worth is tied up in a liquid stock, or the private equity baron whose fortune exists on paper. Wealth in the Gilded Age, as now, was largely a fiction, a claim on future earnings that could vanish in an instant when confidence failed. What the panics reveal about preservation is even more important. The wealthy preserve their fortunes not by being smarter or more careful, but by being more connected. Cook lost everything because he was isolated. His European funding dried up. His political allies could not save him, and his competitors, including a young J.P. Morgan, were happy to see him fall. Morgan survived because he was the center of the network, the man everyone called when things went wrong. In a crisis, the center of the network survives. The periphery does not. That is not economics. That is physics. The Gilded Age panics are not history. They are a mirror. Every modern market crash follows the same script: a bubble, a trigger, a panic, a rescue, and a recovery that leaves the wealthy wealthier and everyone else poorer. The names change, the technology changes, the regulations change, but the underlying mechanics of ownership, control, and money do not. The people who control the system when it breaks are the people who control the system when it is rebuilt, and they always rebuild it in their own image. That is what the Gilded Age panics teach us, not that history repeats itself. That is too simple. They teach us that financial power is not about money. It is about control. It is about who gets to decide which institutions are too big to fail and which ones are allowed to burn. It is about who has the phone number of the Treasury Secretary and who does not. It is about who gets locked in the library and who gets locked out. In 1873, in 1893, in 1907, and in 2008, the answer was always the same. The people in the room made the decisions, and everyone else paid the price. The only thing that changed was the size of the room.